In 1954, Tony Leswick scored one of the greatest goals in Detroit Red Wings history, winning the Stanley Cup. He should have been a legend. Yet, just a year later, the hero was pushed out by his own team and slowly faded into oblivion. This is not just a story about a historic goal, but also a story about an internal feud that buried the legacy of a champion. To understand Tony Leswick's rise and fall, you have to transport yourself back to a world that feels both familiar and alien. North America in the early 1950s. This was the post-war boom, a time of burgeoning suburbs, chrome-plated cars, and the golden age of television. There was a palpable sense of optimism in the air, a belief that progress was inevitable. But beneath that shiny surface was a rigid, almost feudal, social order. You knew your place. You respected authority. You didn't rock the boat. Nowhere was this more true than in the National Hockey League. Today, we think of the NHL as a global, multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Back then, it was a gritty, intimate, and often brutal fraternity of just 6 teams: the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Boston Bruins, the Chicago Blackhawks, the New York Rangers, and the Detroit Red Wings, the original 6 era. Players didn't travel by chartered jet. They took long, overnight train rides, playing cards and nursing their wounds. The arenas were smaller, darker, and filled with smoke. The fans were right on top of the glassless boards, and they could reach out and touch their heroes, or their villains. The players themselves were a different breed. They were mostly farm boys from the Canadian prairies, forged in the unforgiving cold of a Saskatchewan winter. They were tough, humble, and deeply grateful just to be earning a living playing a game. And the owners, the men who ran the league, knew it. The contract system of the day was called the reserve clause. Once a player signed with a team, he was effectively that team's property for life. He went where they told him to go. He played for what they told him he was worth. And if he complained, there was a long line of other farm boys ready and waiting to take his place. There was no free agency, no multi-million-dollar contracts, and certainly no players' union. The owners were kings, and they ruled their little fiefdoms with an iron fist. And in the city of Detroit, the King of Kings was a man named Jack Adams. Jolly Jock Adams, as he was ironically known, was the general manager and coach of the Red Wings. He was a brilliant hockey mind, a master strategist who had built one of the greatest dynasties the sport has ever seen. The Detroit team of the early 1950s was a juggernaut. They were led by the legendary production line: Gordie Howe on the right wing, Ted Lindsay on the left, and Sid Abel at centre. They were gods in Detroit, the heart and soul of the Motor City. The Olympia Stadium, their home rink, was nicknamed the Old Red Barn, and under Adams's rule, it was a fortress. But Adams was more than just a manager. He was a patriarch, a dictator, a puppeteer who controlled every aspect of his players' lives, on and off the ice. He was known for his explosive temper and his unwavering belief that his way was the only way. He loved his players like sons, as long as they were obedient sons. But if you crossed him, if you dared to question his authority, his paternal warmth could turn to ice in an instant. This was the world Tony Leswick was about to step into. A world of glory and greatness, but a world built on a foundation of absolute, unquestionable power. Anthony Joseph Leswick wasn't born to be a superstar. He was born in Humboldt, Saskatchewan in 1923 into a family of hockey players. He and his 2 brothers, Pete and Jack, grew up on the frozen ponds of the prairies, where hockey wasn't just a sport, it was a way of life, a potential ticket out of a hard life of farming or mining. From a young age, Tony was smaller than many of the other boys, so he learned to play the game differently. He couldn't outmuscle them, so he had to outsmart them and, more importantly, out-annoy them. He became what hockey players call a pest. He was a relentless forechecker, a yapping, chirping, stick-swinging agitator who got under the skin of his opponents. He lived to disrupt, to throw the other team's star players off their game. But he wasn't just a pest. The boy could play. He was a swift skater with a surprisingly quick shot. After a stint in the army during World War II, he finally made it to the NHL with the New York Rangers in 1945. There, he formed a line with two other Saskatchewan boys, and they were, appropriately enough, dubbed the Saskatchewan Line. In New York, he honed his craft. He became known as one of the league's premier shadows, a player tasked with shutting down the opponent's best scorer. He famously drove Montreal's legendary Maurice the Rocket Richard to distraction, goading the fiery superstar into countless penalties. One newspaper account from the time described Leswick's style perfectly. He is a mosquito, a gnat, a flea. He buzzes, he bites, and just when you are about to swat him, he is gone and the puck is going the other way. He earned the nickname Tough Tony, but it wasn't just for his physical play, it was for his mental fortitude, his sheer refusal to be intimidated by anyone. But the Rangers were a struggling team, and in 1951, after 6 seasons in New York, Tony Leswick was traded. He was sent to the Detroit Red Wings. For Leswick, it was the break of a lifetime. He was leaving one of the worst teams in the league to join the best. He was going from the outhouse to the penthouse. He was about to share a locker room with living legends. Gordie Howe, the quiet, prodigiously talented farm boy who would become Mr. Hockey. Ted Lindsay, the fierce, undersized captain whose intensity was matched only by his loyalty. And Alex Del Vecchio, the elegant, masterful playmaker. Leswick wasn't there to be the star. He knew his role. He was there to be the grit, the sandpaper that made the Red Wings machine run smoothly. He was the fourth-line grinder, the penalty killer, the guy sent out to protect a lead in the final minutes, and he embraced it. The fans in Detroit, a blue-collar city that respected hard work above all else, fell in love with him. He was one of them. He wasn't blessed with Howe's God-given talent, but he compensated with a heart that was second to none. He quickly became a favorite of his teammates, a respected voice in the room. He had found a home. For 3 seasons, life was good. The Red Wings were dominant, winning the Stanley Cup in 1952. Leswick was a champion. He had reached the pinnacle of his sport. He couldn't have known that his greatest moment and the beginning of his tragic downfall was still to come. The 1953-54 season was a battle. The Red Wings once again finished first in the league, but their arch rivals, the Montreal Canadiens, were right on their heels. It was a clash of titans, and it seemed preordained that they would meet in the Stanley Cup final. And so they did. The series was a brutal 7-game war. The two teams traded blows, each victory answered by a crushing defeat. It all came down to a single game, Game 7, on home ice at the Detroit Olympia. The tension in the old barn that night was suffocating. Every shot, every save, every body check was met with a collective gasp or a roar from the packed crowd. The game was tied 1-1 after 60 minutes of grueling, heart-stopping hockey. It was going to overtime. In the Stanley Cup final, overtime isn't timed. You play until someone scores. The next goal wins everything. It's called sudden death for a reason. As the Red Wings prepared for the overtime period, the exhaustion was etched on every player's face. Jack Adams, pacing behind the bench like a caged lion, sent his troops over the boards. 4 minutes and 29 seconds into the extra frame, the puck was cleared out of the Detroit zone. Tony Leswick, just doing his job, picked it up at center ice. He skated into the Montreal zone, not on a breakaway, but just to dump the puck in and allow for a line change. He wasn't trying to score. He was just trying to make a safe, simple play. He flicked the puck towards the net from about 40 feet out, a high looping shot. It was what hockey players call a floater. It was meant to be an easy save for Jerry McNeil, the Montreal goalie. But then, something strange happened. Montreal's veteran defenseman, Doug Harvey, one of the greatest to ever play the game, instinctively reached up with his glove to knock the puck down. He just grazed it. It was the faintest of touches, but it was enough. The puck changed direction, fluttering, dipping, and wobbling like a wounded bird. McNeil, who had been perfectly positioned, was now helpless. He watched in horror as the puck sailed over his shoulder, hit the top of the net, and dropped onto the ice behind him. For a split second, there was silence. A collective, confused silence. Did that just happen? And then, the explosion. The red light flashed, the horn blared, the Detroit Olympia became a vortex of sound. The Red Wings poured onto the ice, mobbing a stunned Tony Leswick, who could barely comprehend what he had done. He had scored one of the strangest, flukiest, and most important goals in the history of the Stanley Cup. He had won the championship for the Detroit Red Wings in Game 7 overtime. Newspaper reports from the next day captured the bedlam. Leswick's lucky shot wins cup, one headline blared. Another described the puck as a drunken butterfly. In an interview years later, Leswick himself recalled the moment with his characteristic humility. "I just threw it at the net," he said. "I was as surprised as anyone when it went in. I think poor Doug Harvey felt worse about it than Jerry McNeil did, but it didn't matter how it went in. It only mattered that it did." Tony Leswick, the grinder, the pest, the role player, was the king of Detroit. He had delivered the city its holy grail. It was a moment of pure, unscripted magic. In that moment, he was more than a hockey player. He was a folk hero. His place in the city's history, in the sports lore, should have been secure forever. The glow of a championship can hide a lot of things. While the city of Detroit celebrated, a storm was brewing within the Red Wings locker room, a storm that would ultimately consume Tony Leswick's career. The seeds of this storm had been planted years earlier, and they revolved around a simple, radical idea. That hockey players were not just property, but men who deserved a say in their own careers and a fair share of the profits they generated. The champion of this cause was none other than Detroit's fiery captain, terrible Ted Lindsay. Lindsay was a superstar, a future Hall of Famer, but he was also a man of deep principle. He saw his fellow players, many of whom had little education and no job prospects outside of hockey, being treated like disposable assets by the owners. He saw them playing with crippling injuries for meager salaries. He saw them discarded by the league after their bodies gave out, with no pension and no medical care. And he thought it was wrong. Quietly, Lindsay began talking to players around the league. He, along with star defenseman Jimmy Thompson, started to organize the first real attempt at a players' association. Their demands seem almost laughably modest by today's standards. They wanted a guaranteed minimum salary of $7,500. They wanted the league to contribute to a pension plan. They wanted a clearer definition of player contracts and a say in how the league's finances were handled. It was about basic dignity and security. When the owners got wind of this, they were apoplectic. To them, this wasn't a negotiation. It was a rebellion. It was an attack on their absolute authority. And no owner took it more personally than Jack Adams. Adams saw the union as a direct betrayal, a challenge to his throne. He believed he had created a family in Detroit, and Ted Lindsay was committing treason. Adams launched a campaign of intimidation. He called players into his office one by one, demanding to know if they supported Lindsay. He threatened them. He told them their careers would be over if they signed on with the association. The pressure was immense. Many players, fearing for their livelihoods, buckled, but some didn't. Some, out of loyalty to Lindsay and a belief in the cause, stood firm. One of those men was Tony Leswick. Leswick was not a star like Lindsay. He didn't have the same leverage or job security, but he was a man of character. He had seen the injustices firsthand. He believed in what Lindsay was doing. He and a few others, including Gordie Howe for a time, became the core of the nascent union's support within the Red Wings locker room. For Jack Adams, this was an unforgivable sin. Lindsay was the ringleader, but Leswick was a conspirator. He had chosen a teammate over his boss. He had chosen principle over obedience. The Red Wings won the Stanley Cup again in 1955, their fourth in 6 years. On the surface, the dynasty was as strong as ever. But behind the scenes, Adams was sharpening his knives. He was determined to crush the Union and make an example of those who had defied him. The public knew nothing of this internal war. They just saw their beloved champions lifting the cup, smiling for the cameras. The fallout came swiftly and brutally. He systematically dismantled the heart of his championship team. His first target was the head of the snake. He traded Ted Lindsay, the captain and soul of the team, to the league worst Chicago Blackhawks. It was a stunning, vindictive move designed to humiliate Lindsay and send a message to every other player in the NHL. This is what happens when you cross us. The city of Detroit was in shock. Trading Ted Lindsay was like trading the Spirit of Detroit statue. It was unthinkable. Adams didn't stop there. He also traded away Jimmy Thompson, the other union organizer. And then, he turned his attention to Tony Leswick. For Leswick, the punishment was perhaps even more cruel. He wasn't given the dignity of a trade to another NHL team. Instead, just before the 1955-56 season, Adams unceremoniously demoted him to the minor leagues, sending him to the Edmonton Flyers of the Western Hockey League. At 32 years old, just 18 months removed from scoring the most famous goal in franchise history, Tony Leswick was an outcast. He had gone from Stanley Cup hero to minor league exile. It was a public shaming. Adams was making it clear that Leswick was no longer fit to wear the Red Wings jersey. After a season in the minors, Leswick was finally traded to Chicago, joining his friend Lindsay on a team that was a laughingstock. But his time there was short. After just one more season, his NHL career was over. He wasn't finished with hockey, though. The game was in his blood. He returned to the Edmonton Flyers in the WHL, where he became a player coach. For the next few years, he bounced around the minors, a ghost of the NHL, a cautionary tale whispered in locker rooms. He played with the same grit and tenacity, but the bright lights of the Olympia were a distant memory. The man who had once been the toast of Detroit was now playing in front of sparse crowds in small Western Canadian towns. Jack Adams had not only ended his career, he had effectively banished him from the kingdom. He had taken his moment of immortality and buried it under an avalanche of spite. After his playing career ended, Leswick, rather than being bitter, remained involved in hockey, moving into coaching and scouting, even working for the Red Wings themselves after former manager Jack Adams left. Although his game-winning goal in 1954 is famous, Leswick himself has been reduced to a minor character in history. The story of his important role and conflicts with the management has been obscured because it tarnishes the perfect image of the Red Wings dynasty. His absence from the Hall of Fame is the clearest example of injustice. Despite Leswick's memorable career and historic moment, he was never inducted. This is believed to be due to the influence and long-standing feud between Jack Adams and the former management. Leswick rarely spoke publicly about the bitterness. When asked, he only affirmed that he sided with Ted Lindsay because friends stick together. This showed that he acted out of principle and friendship, regardless of the cost. Ted Lindsay, the friend Leswick supported, later became a celebrity and always acknowledged the sacrifice of people like Leswick. They were the silent martyrs in the fight for players' rights, whose careers and legacies were destroyed. Tony Leswick died on July 1st, 2001, at the age of 78. He died quietly in British Columbia, where he had built a quiet life away from the spotlight that once shone so brightly on him. There were no headlines or national memorials. His death, like much of his post-career life, was modest. The official obituaries in the newspapers were brief, listing him as former Detroit Red Wings player and 1954 Stanley Cup winner. They recorded the facts, but they lacked the soul of the story. The real reaction, however, was not in the mainstream press. It came from two separate emotional sources. For older Detroit fans who were at Olympia that fateful night, or who listened on the radio, the news of his death was a jolt of memory. It took them back to that glorious moment, and they didn't just remember the goal. They remembered Tough Tony, the plucky little guy who fought for their jersey. The deeper reaction took place in a new space of the era, the internet. On hockey history forums and early blogs, Leswick's passing sparked a quiet wave of discussion. These were not just condolences, they were reminiscences, and to some extent, a belated collective repentance. The greatest lesson from Tony Leswick's life is one of integrity. When faced with a choice between his career and his friends, he chose his friends. He may have lost his place in the NHL, he may have been forgotten by history, but he never lost his honor. His story celebrates a different kind of hero, the one who does the right thing, even when it costs him dearly. His legacy is a warning. Powerful institutions can rewrite history to serve their interests. It teaches us to look for the stories that are overlooked. Tony Leswick's name may not be in the Hall of Fame, but his legacy is woven from sacrifice and loyalty. He was the hero who scored the winning goal, but more importantly, he was the man who stood up for what he believed in. That is a legacy that no one can take away.